Hello, what's up all? My name is Tita Koshi. Welcome back to another episode of the Fractional Typology Project. We're going to be talking about Ladybug from Bullet Train and comparing him on the Big Five system. So beware, there are spoilers ahead. So these are his votes. The biggest consistencies here and the largest votes are unstructured and agreeable. And these are things that people broadly agree on. Um, Social seems to be something that people think in majority. Calm also seems to be highly up there. And also inquisitive seems to be highly up there. Interestingly, the split between SCUAI and RCUAN seems pretty stark. When people voted SCUAI, they might have been thinking about the ENXP interpretation that he gets voted with a bit too. So, in my opinion, this is the problem is that and we'll talk about this a little in the questions and inconsistency section. So, and this gets into my problem with the Big Five in general. The traits of the Big Five are not a specific thing you do, but a general way that you are. And this can be quantified by the questionnaires you take. But those questionnaires confront you with a question and then take and quantify your answer and then treat that quantification as a more specific trait without acknowledging the underlying framing that it's putting you into. When it's asking you a question and then you give an answer and the whole thing. The byproduct of that is that even though there is that kind of quantification, the traits of the Big Five are very broad. So what exactly is it to be introverted? Like, it's to the point where, like, kind of as a joke, but kind of not, Dreg would say that, like, the concept of introversion doesn't even exist, that there are no introverts, that that's a thing that people are making up. And I don't know if I would go that far, but all of these terms, because here's the problem, and I'm already getting into the questions and inconsistencies section. These traits are a byproduct of factor analysis, such that every human trait was sort of put in a big blender and blended together until these five things could be extracted from that. And that makes them very jelly-like. They adapt to all kinds of people for all kinds of reasons. And so clearly, Ladybug seeks out peace and quiet on his own. Like, he wants to get to a Zen garden, right? But the tension of his own situation makes me hesitate to call that an individual leaning. If Ladybug had good people with him, would he be that uncomfortable with it all? And I think that's a good thing to think about. But I think it's a bit of a non-starter in a way that frustrates me with more jelly-like typologies, because even if we could ascertain whether or not Ladybug is more introverted or more extroverted, like, that is not core to who Ladybug is. Like, you're sort of measuring a surface trait or a symptom of some deeper underlying psychology and then saying, well, this is indicative of the person. And it's like, no, it's not. What's indicative of Ladybug is not his relationship with people and energy, but his relationship with peace. I think if there were people that Ladybug could feel peaceful around and generally good times with good people, I think that we would measure Ladybug much more as socially. And the fact that that can change on a dime means that we're measuring the symptom. We're measuring a dependent variable. We're not measuring the independent variable that actually determines his orientation. And I think that the Big Five has a problem with this because in its applicability to as wide of a net of human traits as possible, it loses the distinction to talk about the shape of individuals. Same thing with limbic and calm. Like, uh, Ladybug is clearly stressed throughout the movie, clearly anxiety induced and panicking. And it's interesting that people don't see this. Like, the way that people voted mostly calm, I think, complies heavily with like this tri-type fix 7 idea that people have of Ladybug. But like, he's a charismatic guy, but he's also fundamentally anxious about the whole affair. You know, fundamentally peace seeking. And I think his charismatic nature makes that harder for people to see. Um, I think that people who have the anxiety that Ladybug has might present more meek in a way that makes it easier to say, oh, that's what they struggle with. But if you look into bullet training, you look into Ladybug, I think it's pretty clear that he does struggle with not only his six fix, but also his limbic nature. Um, but again, how much is that a byproduct of his stressful environment? Now, I will say on that front that the others are in a stressful environment too, and they react in a much calmer way. And I think that calm types in general do react well under pressure, but that's such a broad statement of so many different types of people and types that I'm not really comfortable saying that. And the hesitation is a good thing, right? The hesitation is a good thing, especially in the ways that Big Five is used scientifically to talk about broader human distributions. It's like, well, calm types correlate with this other type of behavior to this extent. And the quantization of that is very valuable. But like what it misses is it presumes uh, explanatory phenomenology about underlying humans and their behavior and their nature. And that's the thing that I think I don't really agree with. And then Ladybug is clearly unstructured, leaning on Maria for structure and organization. I think that's pretty self-evident. The problem is that like there's so many examples of these things that again these traits are so general that like you can't really talk about specifics because if you talk about the specifics, you start to get into how the trait itself is not a good indication of what's actually going on underneath. Like Ladybug Ladybug loses his ticket. That's not very organized, that's not very structured. He doesn't really double check to see like, oh, do I have what I need? Do I have my key? Do I have my ticket? But that's because Ladybug's mind is elsewhere. Ladybug is reminiscing on the past. He's thinking about uh, his experience with Tokyo and how polite people are. He's thinking about Carver. He's thinking about all kinds of stuff. And during that, he is FINI processing what he's going through. And that is like a deeper description of what's going on that Big Five does not contain. In fact, I think that even the distinction of conscientiousness rings of the coercion of organized systems to say you need to be here, you need to be punctual, you need to perform in XYZ way, that is indicative of the way that we organize human beings in the modern day, which then creates the way that our language forms more than an underlying trait about humanity in particular, if that underlying trait is more complicated and less easily standardizable. It's more of a byproduct of civilization than it's a byproduct of internal human psychological structure. Um, and that's the thing that bothers me because to call Ladybug unstructured, I think does a disservice to like what he's prioritizing instead of that organized structure, which is implicit when we talk about organized structure because organized structure is what organization is organizing. But unstructured is like, it's not saying, oh, they do this instead. It's saying, oh, they are unstructured. You know what I mean? It's not uh it's inquisitive and non-curious. As if the gap of this is its own trait, and it's not. And that language obscures what people are actually doing underneath that. Um, People didn't debate this at all. Ladybug is pretty clearly agreeable. He's nice to everybody, and struggles to understand egocentric people and their actions. And then, as I talked about with curious, now Ladybug actually is inquisitive, in my opinion, so that's not really a concern. But there will be characters that are less inquisitive later on, and I think that that is an obscuring term. Again, I think that ever since the Renaissance, we've recognized, well, obviously before the Renaissance, human progress has been largely directed by technology, and technological development has been largely directed by inquisitiveness, the willingness to look into things and understand why they are the way that they are. This is an incredibly useful thing. Describing people's temperament as far as this kind of largely abstract reasoning is concerned is important civilizationally. But when we're talking about the depth of who people are, again, this sort of civilizational input heavily weights the words we use to describe who people are, and then heavily weights the kinds of shapes that people are allowed to take in the bounds of language and conceptualization. And then sort of the more inconvenient or hard to process elements of people are sort of pushed off to the side. So if I were to call Tangerine non-curious, I think that that's doing a disservice to what Tangerine is doing, because yeah, Tangerine doesn't want to know all the details for everything, but Tangerine is, in order to prioritize what Tangerine is doing, in order to prioritize the mission in the moment, there is an adept filtering of importance going on in the way that Tangerine considers X, Y, and Z. And to brush all of that off as non-curious just because it doesn't fit the idea of inquisitiveness is, again, a big problem for addressing the nuance of human psychology. And this is where I talk a little bit about, because the Big Five is an outcome of factor analysis, it dilutes the traits, and it removes them from their fundamental root. And that even though typologies can be wrong because they're bolder and more specific, I also think that typologies get closer to the actual psychological shape of people. This gets into why I'm even making the FTP. Because if I believed that the Big Five, which is the most scientifically supported typology system, was actually sufficient at describing the range and extent of human behavior, then I wouldn't have the interest that I do in the other typologies and their ability to explain really good sometimes, and then other times not so good, and so in the face of that sort of journey of what does and doesn't work in broader typology, the Big Five falls flat because it is literally, scientifically, the most diluted language possible for talking about the wide net of humanity, and that is an insufficient frame for talking about the nuance of humanity. So, as to put it all together, Ladybug is RLUAI, reserved, limbic, unstructured, accommodating, and inquisitive. This is not a very productive combination. It's also not a very organized or consistent combination, and so this can frustrate Maria, who has to take the all of these different traits and try to put them into a productive lens, and yet his agreeableness means that they can still manage to do this together. Now, as far as Ladybug goes, as far as Lemon goes, Lemon is in ways kind of the opposite to Ladybug. SE in the ego block, SI in the ignoring block, um, or in the id block. So ignoring, well, really demonstrative SI, but it's still in the id block. So it's being ignored in comparison to force. Uh, you know, Lemon keeps calm under pressure. He is comparatively organized, egocentric, and these traits make him dismiss Ladybug early. Uh, and to that degree, it's like Lemon excels in these kinds of things, but also struggles with the kinds of things that uh, Ladybug understands because of the time he's putting in. Like, Lemon has sort of his, cruder typology system of Thomas the Tank Engine to try to understand people, but I also think that Ladybug's mindset gives him a more intuitive and emotionally intuited, it's a little redundant, but like intuitive and emotionally in tune understanding of the dynamics of other people that Lemon lacks. And I think it's only after the elder snaps at him that he realizes, like, oh, maybe there's more to Ladybug. Maybe I've been too much of an asshole that way. So Tangerine is, I think, too far away from Ladybug to come to that sort of begrudging, like, oh, maybe there's something to blah blah blah. Like they are pretty far apart. Um, there's also this dynamic, and it's the same thing with the White Death. The White Death and Tangerine both brush off Ladybug for similar reasons. That they're both SLEs, they're both core eights. The things that Ladybug values and the places where Ladybug lives, reserved, limbic, uh, unstructured, agreeable, and like the whole thing. Especially with the White Death, who I'll talk about later, is like basically the opposite of Ladybug. Um, does not agree with him, and Tangerine mostly just thinks of him as an annoyance. The prince takes advantage of Ladybug's agreeable nature, but doesn't really understand him beyond that. The elder catches on to the ways that they could be compliant in terms of good, in terms of big five temperament, um, and it causes them to get along. And like I said, the White Death is almost the complete opposite of Ladybug: social, calm, organized, and egocentric versus reserved, limbic, unstructured, and accommodating. And ISFP versus ENTJ. Which is why he is so insulted when he's like, he calls him like, chill out, bro. It's like, do not call me bro. It's like he hates the idea, as someone who is running this broader enterprise and who's in control. He hates the idea of being as um, whim to fate and as unstructured and to the wind as Ladybug is. So. And then these are the gold tier RLUAI characters. You'll recognize Wirt from my video, from Introduction to the FTP, but these other three characters, there's a pattern here. Like, you can clearly see a kind of like INFP, anxious, 6 wing 5, persuasion, 9, socially agreeable, at times brooding and caught up in one's own emotions. Um, Again, these are the characters who are gold tier RLUAI. There are a lot of characters that are RLUAI and then are debated as other things. This is the jelly of it all. And it's also that, like, these characters comply enough with the community's idea of RLUAI, not necessarily that they're indicative of something broader with RLUAI. Like, gold tier characters for something more specific, like SLE or ESFJ or something like that, like, it helps you understand the way in which those terms are used. But when the terms themselves are general, like these ones are, it doesn't help you understand it as much as, like, I guess, see it a little in context. But like, RLUAI is not a thing as much as like it is a bundle of 5 completely separate traits that also have their own underlying root for why they direct behavior the way that they are. Um, and I think you can only really understand it's interesting because the use of Big Five in that sense, you have to work your way out of the normal typology mindset. It's like, oh, we need to understand RLUAI. It's like, no, that is not a thing. Really, like you're measuring kind of those traits, but those traits aren't really an underlying thing. So it's making an entirely different claim. Um, but nevertheless, it's still, it can be useful to understand and learn. I just think as a psychological language, it's a little weak compared to the alternatives in the FTP. And that is everything. So thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.